The scream that tore through the midnight air of the Vane plantation was not one of passion. It was a sound of pure, primal terror. It shattered the humid stillness of the 1811 Georgia night, a night that was supposed to be one of celebration. Inside the opulent main house of Sorrow's End, the wedding feast had concluded hours ago. Julian Vane, the golden heir to the Vane fortune, and his new bride, Eleonora Preston, had retired to their chamber. The union was meant to solidify the Vanes' dominion over the county, merging their established power with the unusual reputation of the Preston line. But the sound that came from the bridal chamber was not one of union. It was one of violation. When the family matriarch, flanked by two terrified house servants, finally forced the locked door, the scene that greeted them was something lifted from a forbidden, macabre nightmare. The room was heavy with the coppery scent of fresh blood. Julian Vane was slumped against the ornate mahogany headboard, his eyes wide with a vacant horror, his pristine white nightshirt slashed open at the throat. But he was not dead. He was watching his bride, Eleonora, who was kneeling on the floor, her back to the door. The crimson stain was blooming across the pristine white lace of her nightgown, but it was not her blood. When she turned, the candlelight caught the horrifying glint in her eyes, her lips, her chin, her throat. They were slick and dark, glistening with the blood of the man she had just married. A chilling silence descended, thicker and more suffocating than the Georgia humidity. The servants shrieked and fled. The matriarch, a woman forged in the harsh realities of plantation life, stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her. Eleonora simply watched. There was no hysteria in her expression, no madness, only a terrifying, calm, and profound stillness. Her gaze was not one of guilt, but of completion. Julian Vane, the groom, tried to speak. His mouth opened, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged. His face was a mask of shock, pale as winter frost, his throat revealing a precise, almost surgical incision. It was not a tear, not a bite, not the work of a frenzied animal. It was a cut. This single, horrifying observation turned the scene from a crime of passion into something else entirely. Something cold, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Within minutes, the patriarch, Marcus Vane, was in the room. His face, usually a fortress of aristocratic composure, crumbled for a brief second before hardening into iron. He barked orders. The servants were to be gathered and sworn to silence on pain of death. The family physician was to be summoned, not the local doctor. This abomination, would be contained. The wedding night at Sorrow's End had not ended in union, but in a forbidden ritual. The Vane family, in their attempt to secure their legacy, had just unleashed a darkness that threatened to consume them all. The macabre secret of Eleonora Preston was out. To understand the horror of that night, one must first understand the world in which it occurred. This was 1811. Georgia was not the genteel, civilized landscape of later mythology. It was a frontier, a dark and humid tapestry of sprawling plantations carved violently from the wilderness. The rule of law was thin, and society was a rigid, brittle construct. Below the manicured lawns and white columns, ancient superstitions and folk magic, carried over from the old world and mixed with the forbidden lores of the swamps, held powerful sway. The Vane family represented the new aristocracy. Their plantation, which they had grimly named Sorrow's End, was built on cotton, tobacco, and the brutal enslavement of 200 souls. They were a family of hard men and harder women, obsessed with lineage, purity of blood, and public perception. They were the very picture of Southern Gothic power. Their world was one of control over their land, their property, and most importantly, their reputation. A scandal was not just an embarrassment. It was a crack in the foundation of their entire existence, a crack that could invite ruin. This was a world where appearances were everything, and the truth was a dangerous, malleable substance to be shaped or buried as the patriarch saw fit. The Vanes were masters of burying their secrets. But they had never encountered a secret like Eleonora. Julian Vane was the crown prince of this oppressive dynasty. He was 22, handsome, educated in the North, and poised to inherit it all. He was, by all accounts, the perfect Southern gentleman, a skilled horseman, a charming dancer and utterly, completely subservient to his father's will. Julian was the tool by which Marcus Vane planned to expand his empire. For a year, Marcus had been carefully negotiating a merger of his lands with the vast, undeveloped territories to the south, territories that belonged to the enigmatic, elusive Preston family. The Prestons were a curse word in polite society. They were swamp folk, shrouded in rumor and isolation, but they were rich. Their lands, bordering the vast, creepy expanse of the Okefenokee Swamp, were untouched and rumored to be fertile beyond measure. The price for this land merger was a marriage. Julian Vane was to marry the sole Preston heir, Eleonora. Julian, ever the dutiful son, had agreed. He had met Eleonora only 3 times before the wedding. He reportedly told his closest confidant that he found her unsettling, but that her beauty was a thing of strange, dark art. He had no idea how accurate his description was. He believed he was marrying a quiet, if odd, heiress. He did not realize he was a lamb being led to a forbidden altar. Who was Eleonora Preston? She was a specter, a mystery wrapped in the humid mist of the swamps. The Prestons were not like the Vanes. They were old blood, far older than any of the Cotton Kings, but they were not aristocrats. They were other. They kept to themselves, living in a decaying, moss-covered manor deep in the cypress groves. They did not attend church. They did not come to town for market days. They entertained no visitors. And the local population, a mix of fearful settlers and Creek tribes, gave their lands a wide berth. Rumors were the only currency by which the Prestons were known. It was said they practiced a dark and macabre form of folk medicine. It was whispered that their women were wise in the ways of the earth and that their bloodline was tainted. The most disturbing story was of Eleonora's mother. She had not died, she had simply vanished. Years earlier, some said the swamp had claimed her. Others, in hushed tones, said she had been banned by her own family for an unnamed, horrifying transgression. Eleonora was the last of her line, raised in total isolation by a stern, silent father who had seemingly offered her up to the Vanes to save his own dying legacy. She arrived at Sorrow's End a week before the wedding, a pale, black-haired wraith who moved through the opulent halls like a ghost, her eyes holding secrets as deep and dark as the swamp water she was born from. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a creepy and stilted affair. It lasted only 2 weeks, a forced pantomime of propriety orchestrated by Marcus Vane. Julian, dutiful but visibly uncomfortable, would take Eleonora on supervised walks through the manicured gardens of Sorrow's End. She rarely spoke. She would simply watch him, her gaze intense and unnervingly analytical. Where he spoke of the weather, of cotton prices, of the upcoming social season, she would remain silent, occasionally reaching down to touch a dying flower or watch a beetle crawl across the path. Her stillness was a vacuum into which the household poured its own fears. The servants whispered she was touched. Julian's mother declared her a simpleton, but a beautiful one. Only Marcus Vane seemed unconcerned, his eyes fixed on the deeds and maps that would soon be his. Julian, for his part, seemed to oscillate between mild revulsion and a strange, forbidden fascination. He was a man of logic and education, yet he found himself unnerved by her presence. It was, he wrote in his journal, as if a piece of the deep old wilderness has been brought indoors and it does not mean us well. He noted her pallor, her almost translucent skin, and a strange, faint scent that clung to her like damp earth and something metallic. He was marrying a mystery. He had no idea he was sealing his own horrifying fate. The wedding day was a grotesque spectacle of forced gaiety. Marcus Vane had spared no expense. Hundreds of guests from across Georgia converged on Sorrow's End, eager to witness the union of the state's most powerful family with its most mysterious one. The air was thick with roasted meat, expensive French wine, and the suffocating scent of magnolias. But beneath it all lay a palpable tension. The Vanes were triumphant, but the guests were wary. They observed Eleonora Preston as one might observe a captured panther. She was stunning in her white gown, a stark contrast to her jet-black hair and eyes that seemed to absorb the light. She walked down the aisle on the arm of her father, a skeletal man who looked as though he had not seen the sun in a decade. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply existed, a dark void in the center of the celebration. Julian, by contrast, looked pale and strained, his smile tight. As they said their vows, a sudden wind blew through the open doors of the drawing room, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the room into a creepy twilight. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Eleonora did not flinch. As Julian placed the ring on her finger, their eyes met. And for a fleeting, horrifying second, several guests later swore they did not see a bride looking at her groom. They saw a predator sizing up its prey. Back in the Brit Al chamber, the macabre tableau was now under the complete control of Marcus Vane. The physician, a trusted Vane loyalist named Dr. Elias Arkwright, arrived within the hour. He was a man of science, but what he found in that room defied his understanding. Julian Vane was alive, his pulse a frantic, thready beat. He was conscious, but in a state of profound shock, unable to form words, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room where Eleonora had been. Before her father-in-law had her forcibly removed and locked in a guest room 2 floors below. Arkwright examined the wound. It was the most disturbing thing he had ever seen. Located just above the clavicle, it was a single, clean, vertical slit, no more than an inch in length. The edges were not torn but sliced as if by a razor or a fine scalpel. There was surprisingly little blood on the bed linens, suggesting that what had been taken had been collected. "This is not the work of a madwoman," Arkwright whispered to Marcus Vane, his voice trembling. "This is, methodical it is, band work." Marcus Vane's face was a mask of cold fury. He knew this could not be hidden, not fully, but it could be reframed. "She is mad," Vane declared, his voice low and dangerous. "A violent, hysterical fit. You will treat my son. You will speak of this to no one. The girl will be dealt with." Dr. Arkwright set to work, but his task was fraught with confusion. He cleaned and stitched the creepy incision at Julian's throat, a simple enough procedure. Yet the patient's response was anything but normal. Julian Vane, a robust man in the prime of his life, was not recovering from the shock. He was fading. His skin grew colder, his breath shallower. It was not just the blood loss. Arkwright was a battlefield surgeon. He had seen men lose 10 times this amount and survive. This was different. It was as if Julian's very vitality had been siphoned away, leaving an empty, shivering husk. The doctor applied poultices, forced brandy and beef broth down his throat, but nothing arrested the decline. Julian was wasting, a 19th century term for a body in catastrophic, unexplained failure. His pallor was not that of blood loss, but of a blight. It was a deep, unsettling gray. The most horrifying part, however, was Julian's silence. He was not mute. He would moan, he would whimper, but he would not speak. Not of the attack. His eyes, when open, were filled with a bottomless, forbidden knowledge that he could not or would not share. Dr. Arkwright, a man of cold, hard facts, found himself penning a chilling note in his private journal. "It is as if his soul has been tasted and found wanting." While the doctor fought for Julian's life, Marcus Vane began his war on the truth. He was a master of narrative, and he would write the story of this night. First, he secured Eleonora. She was moved from the guest room to the band quarters, a small, fortified cold room in the plantation cellars, originally built to store ice but now used for containment. It was a windowless, stone-walled tomb, and she was locked inside with nothing but a cot and a bucket. She did not fight. She did not scream. Her silence was, in itself, an act of macabre defiance. Next, Vane summoned his overseers and the house staff. He stood before them, a formidable, terrifying figure in the pre-dawn light. He explained that the new mistress, fragile of mind and spirit, had been overwhelmed by the day's events and had suffered a violent, hysterical breakdown. She had, in her madness, accidentally wounded her new husband. It was a tragedy. She would be sent away for treatment. Julian was recovering. The story was simple, plausible, and most importantly, final. Any servant who was heard whispering any other version of the story, any mention of blood, of rituals, or of the creepy look on Eleonora's face, would not just be sold. They would be vanished. The same fate, he implied, awaited anyone who questioned the official Vane story. The cover-up was absolute. But secrets like blood have a way of seeping through the cracks. Vane could control what his servants said, but he could not control what they believed. and they believed in the devil. They believed in the dark spirits of the swamp, and they believed that Eleonora Preston was their high priestess. The servants who had first opened the door had seen the truth. They had seen the blood on her lips. They had seen the chalice. This was the detail Vane had missed, a small silver goblet intricately carved with symbols of snakes and moons sitting on the bedside table. It was not Vane's silver, it was Preston's silver, and it was stained. The servants whispered in their quarters, their voices low and terrified. They spoke of the forbidden lores of the Okefenokee. They said the Prestons were not human, not fully, that they were night drinkers, a cursed line that had to feed on the living to survive. They said Eleonora had not been attacking Julian, she had been sealing him, marking him as her own, a macabre sacrament to bind his soul to hers. The story of the blood bride of Sorrow's End was born that night, a chilling piece of folklore that would outlive everyone involved. The Vanes thought they were dealing with madness. The servants believed they were dealing with a curse. Julian Vane did not die, but he did not live. He lingered in a horrifying twilight state, a living cold case in his own bedroom. Dr. Arkwright was baffled. The wound on Julian's throat healed cleanly, leaving only a thin, white scar. But the man himself was broken. He had developed a profound, disturbing photophobia, screaming in agony if the curtains were opened even a crack. He refused all solid food, subsisting only on water and thin, heavily salted broths. He slept constantly, but his sleep was plagued by nightmares that left him soaked in a cold, clammy sweat. He had lost all his vibrancy, all his color. His skin was the texture of old parchment, and his hair, once a vibrant chestnut, began to turn a brittle, lifeless gray. He was wasting away, but it was a slow degradation, as if he were a clock winding down. Marcus Vane was incensed. He saw his heir, the future of his dynasty, reduced to a shivering, spectral invalid. He brought in specialists from Charleston, from Savannah. They bled Julian. They applied leeches. They dosed him with mercury and laudanum. Nothing worked. The curse, if that's what it was, held fast. Julian Vane had vanished from the world of the living, trapped inside his own dying body. The 19th century was a graveyard of banned truths and forbidden histories. Society, especially the rigid, honor-bound world of the antebellum South, had no mechanism for dealing with anomalies like Eleonora Preston. The world was divided into simple, brutal binaries, sane or mad, civilized or savage, Christian or heretic. What the Vane family was facing did not fit. It was a macabre puzzle that defied their understanding, and so they chose to erase it. This is the fate of so many disturbing historical accounts. They are not solved. They are simply buried, locked away in the cellars of family history until the witnesses are dead and the truth has turned to dust. We create this channel to unearth these cold cases, to give voice to the stories that were forcibly silenced. The truth of what happened at Sorrow's End was deemed too horrifying to exist. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, that the darkness of the past must be brought into the light, subscribe to this channel now. Because the silence that Marcus Vane imposed on his plantation was a fragile one, and in the cellar, Eleonora was not idle. She was waiting. Down in the stone-walled darkness of the cold room, Eleonora Preston Vane remained a figure of creepy, unsettling calm. She was given a ration of bread and water daily. She ate it. She was given no light, no human contact, save for the guard who shoved her food through a slot in the heavy oak door. She did not rage. She did not weep. She did not plead for her release. This lack of hysteria was, to the Vanes, the most disturbing evidence of her guilt. A sane woman, an innocent woman, would be frantic, terrified, desperate. Eleonora was patient. She sat on her simple cot in the darkness, her posture as perfect and rigid as a queen holding court. Marcus Vane visited her once, a week into her confinement. He loomed over her in the flickering lantern light, demanding answers. "What did you do to my son?" he thundered. Eleonora looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the tiny flame. She was paler, thinner, but her gaze had lost none of its intensity. "I did," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "What was necessary?" Vane, for the first time in his life, felt a cold spike of genuine fear. He was not dealing with a madwoman, he was dealing with a believer. Marcus Vane was a pragmatist. His son was dying. The madwoman in his cellar was unrepentant. He needed leverage. He needed to understand the nature of the beast he had invited into his home. He dispatched his most trusted overseer, a ruthless man named Hatcher, to ride south. His mission: to investigate the Preston family, not their finances but their history. Hatcher was to ride to the edge of the Okefenokee, to the decaying Preston manor, and dig up every rumor, every secret, every forbidden whisper he could find. Hatcher was gone for 3 weeks. When he returned, he was a changed man. He was gaunt, his eyes haunted, and he refused to ride at night. He reported directly to Marcus Vane in a locked study, his voice low and trembling. The Prestons, he explained, were not just reclusive. They were feared. The few locals who lived near the swamp boundaries called them the Tainted. They said the family had made a macabre pact with the swamp itself generations ago to survive a blight. Hatcher had found the ruins of the Preston Manor. It had burned to the ground the day after the wedding. Ilian, or his father, had vanished. The blight Hatcher spoke of was the dark heart of the Preston curse. According to the garbled, terrified accounts Hatcher had collected from swamp dwellers and creek medicine men, the Preston line was afflicted by a generations-old wasting sickness. It was not a disease but a condition of the blood, an anomaly that made them pale, weak, and cold, a condition that over time would thin their blood until it was little more than water and they would simply fade away. This was the Preston taint. It was a horrifying genetic dead end, and it had stalked them for a century. But the Prestons had not accepted their fate. They were rumored to have sought a remedy, not from doctors but from the older, darker knowledge of the land. They had turned to forbidden practices, to a syncretic, macabre blend of old-world alchemy and native blood magic. They had sought to rebalance their failing blood, to thicken it, to revitalize it. They had found a way to survive. The rumors were vague, but they all centered on a single, disturbing theme: the necessity of an external source. The Prestons needed something, or someone, else. Hatcher had found more. He had investigated the most disturbing cold case in the region, the disappearance of Eleonora's mother decades prior. The official story was that she had been lost to the swamp, taken by an alligator. The truth, as whispered by the oldest residents, was far more macabre. She had not vanished. She had been banned. She had been exiled by her own husband after she, too, had married into the family and had learned the truth of their remedy. She had, the story went, refused to participate. She had tried to flee with her infant daughter, Eleonora, but had been caught. Her husband, Eleonora's father, had banished her, casting her out into the swamp to die. But Hatcher had found one old Creek woman who claimed that story was also a lie. She said Eleonora's mother had not refused. She had failed. She had performed the ritual incorrectly. And the horrifying consequence of that failure was a curse that had rebounded upon her, driving her into a blood madness that had forced her family to lock her away, before finally returning her to the earth. Eleonora, the woman said, was the last hope of her line. She had been trained since birth to perform the ritual correctly. While Hatcher was uncovering the horrifying folklore of the Prestons, Dr. Arkwright was in his study, poring over his own medical journals, slowly going mad with logic. Julian's condition made no scientific sense. The wasting, the photophobia, the strange, salty broth he craved. It was a cluster of symptoms that belonged to no known ailment. But then Arkwright looked back at his notes from the night of the attack. The wound, the precision, the lack of blood on the sheets, and the silver goblet that the matriarch had screamed for him to ignore. He had examined it. It was not a drinking cup. It was a ceremonial chalice, and the carvings on it were not just snakes. They were Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of cycles, of renewal. He began to form a disturbing hypothesis. What if Eleonora had not been attacking Julian? What if she had not been feeding? What if she had been medicating? What if she was, in her own forbidden, savage way, a physician and Julian Vani was her patient? He re-examined Julian, and this time he looked for the Preston taint. And he found it. a faint, almost invisible pallor that he had mistaken for aristocratic delicacy, a subtle, creepy coldness to the skin that had been there all along. This new macabre theory sent a shiver down the doctor's spine. He returned to Hatcher, who was now quarantined on the plantation, and pressed him for details. Were there other families? Had the Prestons ever intermarried before? Hatcher, reluctant to speak, finally admitted what he had found. Yes, twice before in the last 50 years. Both times the families were from outside Georgia, from Charleston and Virginia. Both times the Preston bride had been married off, and both times the new husbands had vanished, not died, not fallen ill. They had been withdrawn from society. Their families had reported sudden, urgent business in Europe. They had disappeared from the public record, just as Julian Vane was about to. This was not a pattern of murder. This was a pattern of harvesting. The Prestons were not killing their husbands. They were using them. The full, horrifying scope of the Preston family secret was beginning to take shape. They were not just tainted. They were parasites, dressed in the silks of aristocracy, using marriage as a forbidden means of survival. The wedding night was not a celebration. It was the first treatment. Marcus Vane, Dr. Arkwright, and Hatcher convened in the plantation office, the doors locked, the windows shuttered. The truth, in all its macabre complexity, was laid bare. This was not madness. This was ritual. This was a forbidden generational conspiracy. Eleonora was not a killer, she was a practitioner. She had come to sorrow's end with a single, horrifying purpose. She had married Julian not for his land or his name, but for his blood. The taint in her family required a purifying agent, an infusion of healthy, vital blood to thicken their own. The wedding night, the first night of union, was the traditional, sacred time for this joining. She had not been attacking Julian. She had been drawing his blood, mixing it with her own, perhaps with herbs, with wine, and then consuming it. It was a sacrament, a horrifying vampiric act of medicine. Marcus Vane, a man who had built his life on rational brutality, was confronted with an irrational horror. His son had not been attacked, he had been donated. He was now part of this creepy, symbiotic line. The realization was more disturbing than any simple murder. The revelation changed everything. The silence from the cellar suddenly seemed less like defiance and more like starvation. It had been 3 weeks. Dr. Arkwright, his mind now operating in this new macabre paradigm, approached Marcus Vane with a terrifying proposition. If she is what we believe, he argued, then she too is wasting, just like your son. He posited a horrifying theory. The taint was now accelerating in Eleonora, deprived of her remedy, and Julian. He was not just suffering from the blood loss. He was suffering from the severing of the link. What if they needed each other? It was a desperate, forbidden thought. But Marcus Vane was a desperate man. He ordered Eleonora brought from the cellar. She was a wraith. Her skin was a translucent, deathly white, her black hair stark against her skull. She could barely stand. She was dying. Vane, his voice shaking with rage and dread, placed her in a chair. "You are killing my son," he hissed. Eleonora looked at him, her dark eyes dull with sickness. "No," she whispered, her voice like cracking ice. I was saving him." And then the story poured out of her, not in a rush but in a slow, chilling trickle. She confirmed the taint. She called it the thinning, a curse of the blood that had haunted her line since they had first wronged the earth in the old world. Her ancestors had been banned from their homeland, cast out. They had come to the Georgia swamps where the land itself, she claimed, was sick. The thinning had accelerated. Her line was on the verge of extinction, but her great-grandmother, a wise woman, had made a pact not with the devil but with the blood of the land itself. She had learned the old way, the ritual, the joining of vitality. The curse, Eleonora explained, was that her family could not renew their own blood. Their bodies rejected it, but they could absorb the vitality of another. They did not feed on the living, she insisted, her voice gaining a strange strength. They shared. The horrifying truth was that the Prestons were, in essence, a human cold case, a biological dead end, forced into a macabre, parasitic survival strategy. And she was the last practitioner. The joining, she explained, was a sacrament. It was her wedding vow. It could only be performed on the wedding night, the first night of union, when the blood of both lines was open to the other. She had not cut Julian in a frenzy. She had used the sanguis, a sacred silver lancet passed down through her mothers. She had made the incision, the exact same incision, on herself, on her inner thigh. She had collected both their bloods in the silver chalice. She had mixed it with wine and a forbidden powder, the blood root, which grew only in the deepest, creepiest parts of the Okefenokee. This concoction, she claimed, joined them. It did not just save her. It fortified him. She claimed Julian was sick, not with her taint, but with the sickness of the veins, the rot of pride, of greed, of a spirit weakened by the brutality of their civilization. Her ritual, she insisted, was purifying him, binding his strong physicality to her strong spirit and saving them both. She had drunk the blood, their blood, as a vow. It was their first and only true communion. Marcus Vane and Dr. Arkwright were speechless. This was a Foley adieu, a shared madness, or it was the single most horrifying truth they had ever encountered. Eleonora's story was impossible, but Julian was dying, she was dying. If this is true, Arkwright said, his voice trembling, what happened? Why is he wasting? Eleonora's eyes, for the first time, filled with a cold fury. Because you interfered, she hissed at Marcus Vane. The ritual was incomplete, the joining was broken. He is severed from me and he is drowning. In your medicine, she claimed Arkwright's remedies, the mercury, the laudanum, the leeches were poisoning him, fighting the symbiotic link she had tried to forge. She had drunk his blood to save herself. But he was supposed to share in her. They were meant to balance each other. Now they were both dying unbalanced. The macabre irony was that in their civilized attempt to cure Julian, they were killing him. And in their brutal attempt to punish Eleonora, they were killing her. They had, in their ignorance, doomed them both. The history of medicine is a macabre tapestry, stained with disturbing practices. We look back from our modern pedestal and shudder at the cures of the 19th century, the bloodletting, the heroic purging, the dosing of patients with poison. Doctors were often just as dangerous as the diseases they fought. Was what Eleonora did truly any more horrifying than Dr. Arkwright's leeches and mercury? Was a ritualistic exchange of blood, rooted in a forbidden folklore, any crazier than bleeding a man who was already weak? The veins represented modern thought, but it was a brutal thought, rooted in dominance. Eleonora represented the old way, a creepy, symbiotic knowledge rooted in submission. Submission to the blood, to the earth, to the curse. This channel is dedicated to exploring these unsettling gray areas where history and horror bleed together. We look for the cold cases where civilization and magic clashed, and where the true monster is often the one holding the medical text. If you find this forbidden history compelling and want to explore more banned medical practices, make sure you are subscribed. The truth is often more disturbing than the fiction. Marcus Vane was faced with an impossible choice. On one hand, his dying son, the civilized cure failing. On the other, the swamp witch in his study offering an unthinkable alternative, a macabre ultimatum. I can save him, Eleonora whispered, her strength fading. But he must save me. The ritual must be completed properly. The alternative theory, the one that Arkwright and Vane had missed, was that this was not just about her. It was symbiotic. It was a two-way street. Her taint and his vitality, but now both were compromised. She needed his blood to live, but he, severed and poisoned by Arkwright's cures, now needed hers. The horrifying implication hung in the air. The joining was no longer a preventative measure. It was now an emergency transfusion, of the most forbidden kind. Vane, a man of God, a man of property and order, was being asked to sanction an act of vampirism in his own home. He was being asked to choose between his reputation and his son. The climax of the blood bride incident did not happen on the wedding night. It happened 3 weeks later in a shuttered sick room lit by a single candle. The participants, a terrified patriarch, a conflicted doctor, and a dying bride. They brought Eleonora to Julian's bedside. He was barely conscious, a pale, skeletal figure lost in the mountain of linen. Eleonora, herself a ghost, knelt by the bed. She was too weak to use the sanguis, the ritual lancet. She looked to Arkwright. "Your finest blade," she commanded, her voice a rasp. The doctor, his hands shaking, produced a scalpel. He looked at Marcus Vane, who, his face a horrifying mask of agony, gave a single jerking nod. Arkwright, the man of science, was now a participant in a macabre ritual. He made the cut, not on Julian, who had nothing left to give, but on Eleonora. He opened a vein in her own, pale, arm, the blood that thinned. It flowed, dark, slow, thick. This was the horrifying twist, the final revelation. The taint was not a weakness, it was a hunger. The thinning was what happened when she did not feed her blood. Now, 3 weeks, starved, was not thin, it was thick, potent, alive. She had lied, or she had told a half-truth. She didn't just need his blood, she needed to mix it to catalyze her own. The wedding night, that was the lie. She hadn't needed his blood to save him. She had needed his blood to awaken hers, and now her blood, starved, awakened, potent, was the only thing that could save him from the poison of Arkwright's medicine. Arkwright collected her dark, thick blood. In the silver chalice he held it to Julian's lips. Julian Vane, the golden heir, drank. He drank his wife's blood. This was the true macabre sacrament, the true forbidden wedding. The effect was immediate, and it was horrifying. Julian Vane convulsed. His back arched off the bed, a ghastly, inhuman sound tearing from his throat. His eyes snapped open. They were not his eyes. They were clear, vital, and starving. He saw his father, he saw the doctor, and he saw Eleonora kneeling by his bed, bleeding. Into the cup a new understanding dawned on his face. Not horror, not gratitude, but recognition. He reached for her, not as a husband, but as a partner. The ritual was complete. The joining was sealed. Marcus Vane stumbled back, knocking over the candle, plunging the room into darkness. All he could hear in the chilling blackness was the sound of 2 people breathing in unison, and the slow drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the floor. The curse had been passed, or it had been shared. Julian Vane lived. He recovered, in fact, he thrived, but the man who rose from that sickbed was not the son Marcus Vane had known. The jovial, pliant heir was gone, vanished. In his place was a cold, silent predator. His skin retained a creepy pallor. His aversion to the sun remained. He moved with a new predatory grace. He ate nothing save rare meat and drank only dark red wine, and he and Eleonora were inseparable. They spoke without words. They moved as one. They were 2 halves of a single macabre entity. Marcus Vane had saved his son's life, but he had lost his son's soul. He had contained the scandal, but he had unleashed the curse within his own home. Sorrow's end had truly earned its name. The story of Julian and Eleonora vanished from public record. Marcus Vane announced that his son and new daughter-in-law had been called urgently to Europe to oversee family interests. They were seen one last time on a dock in Savannah, boarding a ship. At dusk they wore heavy veils and dark clothing. They spoke to no one. They carried no luggage save one small wooden box clutched in Eleonora's hands. The box, rumored to contain the silver chalice, the lancet, and the last of the blood root powder. They were banned, exiled by the patriarch, who could not bear to look at what he had created. They disappeared into the old world, a new tainted line let loose on an unsuspecting continent, a macabre cold case set adrift. Marcus Vane lived for another 20 years. He ruled sorrow's end with an iron fist, but he was a broken man. He never spoke of his son again. He had no other heirs. When he died, the Vane line died with him. The plantation was sold to strangers who found it unbearably creepy. They said the house felt cold even on the hottest Georgia day. They complained of a faint, metallic smell in the master bedroom. The servants passed down the story, the true story of the blood bride, of the forbidden ritual of the master's son who became a monster. Sorrow's end crumbled, reclaimed by the swamp, a monument to a horrifying secret buried too deep. Legacy of this disturbing event is one of chilling ambiguity. What was Eleonora Preston, was she a monster, a victim of a generational curse, or a practitioner of a forbidden medicine forced into a macabre act by a world that refused to understand her? Was the taint real, a biological anomaly, or was it hysteria, folklore, a psychotic delusion that she and eventually Julian came to share? The lines blur. The truth hides in the shadows between science and superstition, just as it did in 1811. We are left only with the horrifying narrative: a bride, a groom, a chalice, and a forbidden thirst. The only tangible evidence that remained was Dr. Arkwright's private journal. It was not found for a century. It was hidden behind a false backing in his medical study. The journal details everything: the wedding night, the wound, the investigation, the confession, the final horrifying ritual. His last entry on the Vane case is chilling. "I have participated in a work of darkness," he wrote. "I forced life into a man who should have died, and in doing so I fear I have damned his soul and my own. The blood was drunk, the pact is sealed. May God forgive us all." This journal is the cold case file, the only testament to the macabre truth. Today nothing remains of sorrow's end but stone foundations sinking into the Georgia swamp. The land is banned access, private property overgrown with cypress and moss, but locals still tell the story. They say that if you walk the edge of the swamp at dusk, you can sometimes smell magnolias mixed with the coppery scent of old blood. They say the ooze vanished, but the curse remains. The story of the Blood Bride of 1811 survives, a horrifying piece of forbidden folklore, a reminder that the darkest mysteries are not hidden in the shadows but sometimes in plain sight, sealed with a vow and a drink. The wedding night ended, but the thirst that began that night might never have.